Good morning, students. As we know that the objective of fiscal policy is to achieve macroeconomic stability and growth. Today, my lecture is largely on this aspect of fiscal federalism. Basically, this is a part of fiscal federalism. However, in that we are going to discuss things about the adjustment and a different rule-based understanding of federal structure and how this has been incorporated in the Indian context particularly. So we know that this rule-based spending, especially in a federal setup, is largely adopted in the post FRBM world. So I would be concentrating therefore on this aspect. Before that, let me actually come to the portion of fiscal adjustment. The issue related to fiscal adjustment have received considerable attention in the literature. Okay, and our focus is the various theoretical perspective of fiscal adjustment and how various economists, especially the theoretical perspective, which is try to conceptualize what is fiscal federalism, whether we need really fiscal federalism, what much of money can be spent, what much we cannot spend, and for which purpose we can spend and all is a debate. In fact, this were being discussed long ago. So we also present some worldwide experience on fiscal adjustment and then wind up our discussion. So let me come to the theoretical perspective. There are different theoretical paradigms relating with a fiscal adjustment, not largely the neoclassical, Keynesian, Ricardian equivalents, supply side economics, and then modern synthesis. And of late, people are now talking about the neoliberal understanding or neoliberal perspective on federal spending. So all these are the part of the macroeconomic stability and the growth of the economy. So let me first go to the neoclassical perspective. According to that, deficit either imply a reduction in government savings or an increase in the government savings. So this might have a detrimental effect on investment and growth. That is their perspective, and if the reduction in government saving is not fully offset by a rise in private saving, it would result in a fall in the overall saving rate. So this is what is in a nutshell they try to articulate. The falling saving rate, therefore, apart from putting pressure on the interest rate, adversely affect the growth. So as per the new classical perspective, individual plan their consumption over their entire life cycle. So by the shift in tax to future generation, fiscal deficit increase current consumption. So under full employment, in case of a closed economy, increased consumption implies a decrease in the saving. So this is how it has been related, and hence interest rate must rise to bring equilibrium in the capital market. But higher interest rate could also result in a decline in private investment. In case of an open economy, this leads to a real interest rate and investment may remain unaffected. Since the fall in the national saving is financed through higher external borrowing, this will be accompanied by an appreciation of the domestic currency and fall in export. So in both the cases, net national saving falls and consumption rises, accompanied by some combination of fall in investment and export. So then rational expectation and real business cycle school in that neoclassical perspective also asserts that the fiscal deficit caused debt accumulation and interest rate increase, which crowds out the private investment and ignite inflation in a nutshell. So this is what is actually an overall understanding or the perspective which the neoclassicals put forward. Now, several empirical work also based on this particular principle had pointed out that The aim of testing the association existing between, there is an association existing between nominal interest rate and the budget deficit. Especially when most of their studies being centered around the US context, and Felston and Nixon in 1970 had done some work. Then Sebula in 1988 had done a couple of empirical work, and Note into 1999 had examined these aspects, whether there is a relationship between this crowding out, that is the budget deficit, and interest rate in now Germany over a period of 1987 to 97. This is what Note and Dehaan had worked on. So their results suggest that the positive relationship between budget deficit and interest rate could probably be due to a fear that government debt may crowd out private investment. However, to be a very critical point, to make a critical point on this thing, it is from Indian context, there have been studies which was actually nullifies this existence of this sort of an atmosphere. But keeping that empirical portion for a while aside, let us go to the next conceptualization regarding this particular aspect, which is called the Keynesian perspective. That is, the Keynesian perspective is largely talks about if there are unemployed resources in the economy, an increase in autonomous government expenditure in the form of an investment or consumption financed by borrowing would cause output to expand through a multiplier process. They argue that usually budget deficit lead to an increase in the domestic production, which makes private investors more optimistic about the future course of the economy. This expectation results in the private investors investing more and lead to a crowding in effect. Now, many traditional Keynesians argue that deficit need not to crowd out private investment. In fact, for instance, Eisner's work suggests that an increase in aggregate demand enhances the profitability of a private investment and lead to a higher level of investment at any given rate of interest. So, hence, deficit may stimulate aggregate saving and investment despite the fact that they raise interest rate. Similarly, a reduction in budget deficit owing to the implementation of a spending cut spending cut that should result in a temporary slowdown of aggregate demand and the level of economic activity. Now, unlike the argument propounded by the new classicals, where in a reduction in budget would have no effect on the level of economic activity, here, since the supply side is supposed to be the main detriment of economic growth, Keynesian theory postulates that after a fiscal contraction, aggregate demand reduction is the consequence irrespective of the instrument used. Such a reduction will occur either directly through a decrease in the public consumption and investment, or indirectly when families reduces their consumption as a consequence of the lower disposable income brought about by an increase in the taxes or by the increase in the public transfer. So this is a very important perspective as far as the Keynesians are concerned, and this is something which as I pointed earlier, that when the neoclassical understanding is completely opposite of this particular view. So they do also have empirical understanding, and that most of that empirical understanding is in fact substitutes or substantiate the fact that what this theory is in fact has some sort of a positive effect. However, the merit and demerits of all this we'll be discussing later, which is not at this point is important. Now let us look into the other aspects, other perspectives on this spending. Especially the third point is being pushed as the Ricardian equivalence theory, that is largely proposed by Barrow, Rangarajan and Srivastava et al. And according to this particular perspective, fiscal deficit are treated as a neutral one, and in terms of their impact on growth. So the financing of budget by deficit amounts only to postponement of taxes. This is what is a very interesting point as far as this particular perspective is concerned, and the deficit in any current period is exactly equal to the present value of the future taxation that is required to pay off the increment to debt resulting from the deficit. So in other words, government spending must be paid either now or in the future, and the present value of the spending must be equal to the present value of the tax and non-tax revenue. So fiscal deficits are a useful device to smoothen the impact of the revenue shocks, or for meeting the requirement of a lumpy expenditure. The finance of it is by way of tax may be spread over a period of time. However, such fiscal deficits do not have an impact of aggregate demand of household spending decisions are based on the present value of their income. That takes into account the present value of the future tax liability. So alternatively, a decrease in the current government saving implies by the fiscal deficit may be accompanied by an offsetting increase in the private saving, leaving the national saving and therefore investment in the economy unchanged. Hence, there is no impact on real interest rate. This is what is their thrust, and in fact, many economists had a critical point because there is no substantiating evidence on this aspect, because the world's growth of economy or the development of the society is in fact largely deficit financed in that sense. So even the private investment in that sense makes no sense if you have no such positive optimistic mentality. Then especially economists like Prabhat Patnaik and all had pointed out that this is a kind of a miser economy kind of situation, because you don't believe that the deficit financing is going to in fact have a positive effect in the future. However, that is makes a little skepticism on the conceptualization which they had been, and of course there is large number of followers, in fact, or economists in fact, propagate this kind of idea. So I'm not here to basically underestimate the followers the conceptual belief on this particular aspect. However, the recurring equivalence requires the assumption that individuals in the economy are foresighted. So this is the most important example, or the assumption as far as this particular concept is concerned. So they have discount rates which equals the government discount rate on spending, and they have extremely long time horizon for evaluating the present value of the future taxes. Now, the long-term horizon may well extended beyond their own lives, in which case they have, or they save with a motive of making altruistic transfer to take care of the tax liability of their future generation. Now, none of this perspective in fact been, as I said, empirically supported. So there are so many people had a vehement criticism leveled against this particular principle. So now, as far as the three conceptualizations are concerned, like the new classical, the Keynesian, and the Ricardian case, there are many economists, in fact, come in the foray and said that there is a lot of synthesis is possible in this understanding of the spending and the possible returns as part of the fiscal, deficit, or whatever fiscal spending itself, the government spending is concerned. So in that sense, modern synthesis identifies the automatic stabilizer in the economy which act counter-cyclical. Now, if you have such a synthesis, then in fact the counter-cyclical effect is going to be glaring, and during recession fiscal deficit is a natural phenomenon, and fiscal surplus during expansion in that sense. So therefore the economy automatically moves toward full employment equilibrium, and the discretionary fiscal policy is impotent and difficult to implement in that sense. However, the government can use active fiscal policy to respond to the major depressions as kind of a situation. So this is what is about the perspective regarding this particular aspect of federalism as far as the conceptual portion is concerned. But at the same time, there are other views also, in fact, vehemently, curbs the possibility of expansion, fiscal expansion. So one such is called the supply side understanding, and the supply side impact of fiscal deficit in that sense is different. The advocate of this perspective argue that the deficit leads to higher taxes, and the taxes are always distortionary and change in incentive which affect the supply. They believe that those policies have no effect on the output level, which are fully anticipated. However, unanticipated policy affect the output level through the supply side. So the philosophy of neoliberalism is usually considered in the other context. It is basically connected to this particular understanding of supply side along with the new classical understanding. So they also believe that the alternative neoclassical economics, classical liberalism, they're trying to say that they try to synthesize that there is a possibility of going back to the classical liberalism in a new classical framework of the intervention of the government in that sense is not necessarily very powerful, but even if it is, then that is in fact favoring the investors. So this is the government has to be a facilitator in that sense. So it is centered on the conviction in the self-regulating capacity of the market as far as the public policy is concerned. Neoliberalism borrowed from the assumption of neoclassical economics to argue for free trade, low taxes, low regulations, and low government spending in that sense. So one of the main aspects of the neoliberal agenda is curbing the size of the state. Privatization of some government function is one way to achieve this. Another is to constrain government spending through limits on the size of the fiscal deficit and on the ability of the government to accumulate debt. Now, in that context, if we look into, then we can see very obviously that the subnational spending as well as the central spending are all now these days curtailed or put a constraint on it all through the mechanism of rule-based spending. So we will come to that rule-based spending a little later. So now the impact of such a theoretical aspect in the national or subnational level is a very important aspect. That is fiscal adjustment, how the fiscal adjustment is basically works in the national and the subnational level. That is, in the countries of government sector is directly responsible for the large part of the economic activity, and through its spending and resource mobilization indirectly influences the way resources are used in the private sector. Now, substantial evidence exists that in many cases poor fiscal management has been a major factor in underlying macroeconomic problems such as high inflation, large current account deficit, and sluggish output growth. Under such circumstances, while an economy undertakes the process of fiscal adjustment, the fiscal policy play a key role to eliminate these disequilibria. So reduction in the deficit is usually at the center of an overall adjustment strategy to foster the sustained economic growth with the macroeconomic stability. So this is very important as far as this particular concept is concerned. Now, what is actually there are arguments that fiscal adjustment is necessary not only to the national but also on the subnational level in a decentralized system, especially in India. The 60 or 70 years ago, Musgrave recognized that the central government's ability to carry out stabilization policies is adversely affected because decentralization makes counter-cyclical fiscal policy difficult. That is, the central government's contractionary fiscal policy may be countered through expansionary fiscal policy by subnational government. And according to Many economists like Weben, Rao, Furnasari, etc., et al., there is also a tendency for a subnational government to accumulate unsustainable deficit based on their expectation of aid from the center, which adversely affects stability and growth. The central government may also have to share or give up the more efficient tax base by creating higher average deficit at the central level. This is because its direct spending is not reduced as it increases transfer or gives up its tax basis to subnational government. So, keeping all this fact, there are so many empirical studies in that, both positively as well as inversely supports these views. So, I think this is an interesting area one has to look into. However, being a lecture, I'm not going to the details of it. So, but at the same time, when we speak about tax enhancement and expenditure compression, which was the discussion in the earlier point, that is when the fiscal expansion is in place, then how do we expand it? Whether it is through an increase the income or through cutting the spending and having a sort of other means. Although economists recognize that the need for fiscal adjustment at national and subnational level, there is no agreement among them regarding the way in which the adjustment should be brought out. So whether to increase tax or reduce expenditure or adopt a combination of both, since both expenditure cut and revenue agreement have different macroeconomic implication in that sense. So this is a very interesting point someone has to look into. So it has to be observed that while some component of a government expenditure are more productive than others, some tax reforms are more beneficial in their impact on resource allocation than others, and some type of a fiscal adjustment more sustainable than others. So this is a perspective which was put forth by McKinsey and other co-researchers. So economic theory therefore suggests that an expenditure cut will generate more adverse consequences for the economy in the short run than a tax increase. So the reason is that a tax increase would reduce saving rather than consumption, thereby lessening its impact on the economy in the short run. However, a reduction in the government spending would directly reduce consumption. A reduction in public consumption expenditure implies less government borrowing and low domestic inflation. This provides favorable conditions for growth because it enhances the efficiency of the price mechanism in the economy and allocation of resources. Alternatively, studies have shown that cuts in public investment spending affects supply side and economy by increasing domestic price and thereby inflation rate, subsequently leading to the rise in the interest rate. Now, there has been discussions in the literature that impact of tax increases on the macroeconomy, as I said earlier. So, from the future generation to the present generation and the contribution to the reduction in the current private consumption are all depends on this increase in the tax, okay, or the burden may be perhaps shifted. So the point in this whole discussion, and in fact there are many empirical finding which is also supports as well as opposes the view which I have mentioned earlier. So there are many studies, even IMF, Latin American countries, or Asia's Pacific studies. So there are so many studies, in fact, that talks about all these things, especially on the efficacy on the both side, whether we need to have an expansionary thing by cutting, that means by increasing the tax, or in turn it is actually reduces the savings of the private person. So there are different kinds of perspective in that sense, and my view, things need to be understood a little realistically. Now, when I say that actually increasing the spending, there are a large chunk of people who are not investing, who are actually sort of having their savings in the banks, and Somebody has to take that and spend. So this government in fact really do that. They are borrowing money from the banks and they are doing like investment, especially social sectors. So now many people say that these are not these are unproductive, but the issue is that when I would say that if you have a better road, if you have a better education health system, people do work, they tend to work, and they do have a more income in the future. And if in fact that is going to improve the conditions not only of that individual and the state per se, but the total income of the economy is going to expand. This is a very positive understanding. But if the other ways, if the state is not actually spending on the social sectors, then of course you may be having a poor education system, you poor health system, you may be having a poor infrastructure, which curtails you been achieving in that sort of a better income or a sort of better social capital in that sense. And if you don't have that, then it is difficult in fact to have more earning in the future generation, or especially in the future generation. So it is actually counterproductive to basically stick upon that sort of an argument when we speak about spending and public policy is concerned. So I think more apt understanding in this particular context is like the interventionist policies of Keynesian type. And Keynes never say that actually the state has to do everything and every time. So the importance of the state is an essential one, because see the development, when I talk about all these things, see when a pandemic kind of a situation, the world had in fact stumbled in front of such an issue. However, there are states which is capable of doing something, is actually this the state which is having an interventionist mentality, and they withstood. So whether it is in the case of China, whether it is in the case of New Zealand, whether it is in the Scandinavian country, or even in the case of Kerala. So the public spending, especially in the public sectors like health and education, which is in fact empowered the society to understand such a situation and had a better resilient sort of atmosphere being created here. So all these countries and the state in fact had such a beautiful experience. In that sense, it is basically not a correct apt point to argue the other way around, whereas the world, this is a recent phenomena, especially a live phenomena, which is all of us are undergoing in this particular situation. Now given this thing that is about the revenue of that is the revenue issue when it is about the fiscal adjustment. Many people also having a mentality that if the government makes a rule based constraints on spending and all, I mean the world people will go out of it, especially the out of budget expenditure and all. And there are possibilities, and in fact there are many countries including India doing all kinds, though the government see the issue is that the government cannot fully minimize the administrative expenditure, but administrative expenditure anyway will go up in the course of time. So where do you actually reduce your spending? You largely curtail your spending, or you curb sort of a spending in the field of social sector development and infrastructure. So if you do that, then things are not going to work properly as we think. So if that is the situation, then then the people are not going to support you in a democratic structure or in a liberal structure, because people definitely require sort of an intervention and support from the part of the state, because people do think in that sense a state do have a role to play. Now theoretically, even empirically, no country is actually saying anything other than this. And the experiment, because people need actually some sort of a support. Why we need government otherwise? Government is not necessarily necessary in that sense, because we have already discussed in the beginning of our lectures. Now, if that is the case, then different method of fiscal adjustment are commonly considered, including tax enhancement, expenditure reduction, and combination of both. However, government across the world, as I said, have now began to resort to another new phenomenon, which is escape the budget control. When you have more budgetary controls through the all kinds of this rule-based spending and all, off-budget borrowings are going to be the key thing. Now there are borrowings and everywhere it is there. So if you take in case of Kerala, as I the having a state having highest HDI status, highest social indicators, better social indicators when you compare with the whole country. So if you look into that, the off-budget borrowing of the state is very high. And of course, within this rule-based also they do have, because their expenditure in the administrative aspect is increasing enormously, and you can't cut that because of so many reasons. Now, if you say that you just cut, why should you do that? Because you are performing in that sense. If you are better performing, why should I cut spending, which will actually make a lot of negative effect as far as the electoral economies are concerned. So then definitely you will go for off-budget borrowing, and these are borrowings by state-owned firms which do not form a part of the official budget calculation but are used to fund government schemes. Although these off-budget borrowings are not included in the fiscal deficit calculation too, they do form a part of the total debt obligations of the government. Another important point it will be noted is that to the content or extent that such spending is backed by government guarantee. So especially, for example, in the case of masala bonds by different government, central government as well as state governments are now going to float this sort of an bonds. What is that bond is? This is a bond which is in fact a very important one when you have a rule-based system which says that you can't spend, but at the same time this, given the level of the growth or as well as the development of the state, you cannot actually backtrack yourself from spending because it is a commitment of the state, and then if you are doing that, then you are actually moving out of your commitment and your electoral commitment, in fact specifically electoral commitment as well as the development which you promised through your white paper or whatever. So if that is the thing, that things gets more political, and you say that by theory it's not, that is not going to work in that sense. So you have to make a kind of understanding which is realistic in that sense. So suppose if that sort of a realistic concerns play a crucial role, then obviously you don't have actually any other option other than going for an off-budget borrowing, and that is what is in fact takes place in a regular course of action with different firms, government, etc. in India. And indeed, if you calculate that inside the fiscal or budgetary kind of this deficit, then at least from 12 to 20% on an average will be the sort of a deficit which is this the state governments are going to have. And I don't see that there is a big problem in that, because unless you spend you can't move forward. So I believe in that, and we had experience, or we are having experience in many parts of the world in this, and people are now say that even if you have experience, people ask data, then data is there. So if you have problem with it, then disprove it. Okay, so this is what is actually the kind of mentality on this side people have. On the other side, they'll be saying that okay, if you don't have data, then we don't believe in you. So kind of situation. So now in the Ricardian, if that is the case, then a counterproductive statement, this is going to be a counterproductive say, because in the Ricardian equivalence case, many people, many theorists write about this importance, but there is no empirical proof that no Ricardian equivalence is going to hold. So in that sense, things are not going to be that easy as we think. Now, fiscal adjustment and fiscal rules therefore are make a very, very important point as far as the lectures are concerned. Now, now the issue is that whether we need to have a fiscal adjustment which is based on a fiscal rule. So notable features of the worldwide fiscal adjustment process undertaken during the 90s was the introduction of the sound fiscal framework. Now, recognizing the difficulty associated with discretionary fiscal policy, several countries enacted fiscal responsibility legislations, and countries like New Zealand was of the forefront of these reforms. But as I said earlier, though they have a kind, then they have also an off-budget kind of situation. So I'll come to that later. So Australia adopted, UK and European Union, everybody had adopted this particular framework, that is the fiscal responsibility legislations. Now in India also we have a fiscal responsibility legislation of late, that is 2002-3 we had this legislation. There are many empirical studies on fiscal rules that are pointed out that the fiscal rules are associated with positive fiscal outcome, okay, and also found that fiscal rules are associated with a greater fiscal discipline in Latin American countries, in Asian countries, etc. So using a simple sample of 5 Latin American country, the work of Webb found that fiscal responsibility laws are neither necessary nor sufficient for achieving fiscal prudence at multiple layers of government. Now, but they can be useful as mechanism to coordinate and sustain commitment in fiscal prudence. So a study by European Commission 2016 in the euro area found that the primary current account balance on average improved during the years followed the introduction of a fiscal rule, while it remains broadly stable over a 19 to 2005 period. Also, primary government expenditure tended to grow more slowly in the years following the introduction of the numerical expenditure also. Now, there is an important issue, because when you say that these countries are advanced developed country or advanced high income countries, now given the high income nature of the thing, the spending of the government requires minimal, because people have money, people have the opportunity to spend, people have entrepreneurial kind of situation. The cohort of people being treated in these countries are more or less based on class. If you have income, you belongs to this. But in countries like India or it's much more primitive. So you have, even if you have income, you cannot come and spend. Even if you have a sort of other entitlement, you may be lacking some caste, class, religious characterization which impedes you from spending. In such a situation, is it actually a very crucial tool as far as the states are concerned to specifically follow, is a real question as far as this, because again I would like to point out the fiscal development, because it has always been ridiculed as well as been pointed that Kerala is one of the undisciplined state. Now, if regarding the rule-based case, especially the Orisian example, Orissa is one of the state which is having which follows almost like the fiscal responsibility, and they do have actually spending which is less than what is their revenue in that sense. So they don't have a deficit beyond this stipulated, or sometimes they do have even. Now, nowhere the Orisian indicator is matches with the Kerala indicators. So it is not the case, no empirical point in that sense substantiate that Orissa is better than Kerala, though they have a discipline in spending. But at the same time, Kerala, you say that it is having no discipline, but at the same time, the human development indicators is far ahead of any other state in this context. So I don't think that is immediately you can actually derive based on this particular context. This is an indicator of a very sound indicator in that sense. So fiscal adjustment and the human development aspects are concerned, so then I have a completely different opinion, as I said. So different countries' experience indicates that the package of macroeconomic adjustment measures, along with the sharp reduction in the budget fiscal deficit and substantial cut in the social sector. So I don't see, even the United States spends a lot of money on different aspects, in fact, okay. they may not be, see, in the case of subsidy, okay, the third world countries are actually giving a subsidy of fertilizer, which is improves the sort of farms productivity. But in the in the WTO and all this kind of things cannot be given. But on the contrary, what they do is actually they give say, decent living. In India, the farmers don't even have a decent living at all. The concept of decent living is far away from the very concept of the political or the economic understanding. So, since you don't actually give any money for the decent living, what you do is actually you give whatever the penny which you are providing only for the subsidy, productivity enhancement kind. But the problem is actually not going to solve. The farmers are producing much more, but the products are very cheap in India in that sense. So there are so many issues. Not if the farmers are not getting a proper payment for their product, then how do we have a decent life or be decent, living in that sense? So the government has to pay in that sense a little money, which is very little, per head, maybe 50 paise or well, less than 1 rupee gets by a farmer for the whatever, if you divide the farmer's percentage with that of the amount of subsidy which you give, 1 rupee, 2 rupee. But at the same time, for a decent living in America, one farmer, a cow gets 12 or 10 plus dollar per day in that sense. So things are very different in these two different part of the world. So when you immediately take up certain position that you don't actually give the subsidy kind of thing. So what is we are really meaning as well as what we are really aspiring to. So that is a sort of an understanding which one has to have when you are in the policy making regime. So or when you make policy. So a number of countries, therefore, in Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa under macroeconomic adjustment during 80s, as a result, real per capita government expenditure on social services, especially in the health and education, declined in most of these countries. But the countries which is having a better, their per capita expenditure is not actually coming down. And this is quite contradicting to what is actually our aspiration to be better better places as far as this particular concept of fiscal adjustment as well as the development are concerned. So I don't think in that sense that if you have a discipline you will be actually better, but that is also depends on what is your material condition and also what is your entitlement we are inherited or you have. For example, if I am actually inherited a good amount of money from my, whoever, then the point is that I can in fact take care of myself only in one aspect of giving education, because you can spend all. Now, a poor farmer, has to find their living as well as they have to send their children to school. So it's difficult for them. Even the student has to find their own living by themselves. So are they going to excel in the education if they spend too much time in work? Even for their education they have to work. So if their full potential, a person completely funded by X, his or her excellence to that of a person who is working, and their time which has been spent in that education as an indicator by both is completely different. So as well as their productivity in that sense. So I don't think that if you are it is also what I feel is that it is equally important to understand the material condition and the entitlement as far as the states are concerned, and then only you can in fact impose a rule. Definitely there should be some rule, as well as that rule has to have sort of flexibility. And if you don't let the rule to borrow any money, then definitely people will go for out of budget expenditures. And I don't think that there's anything wrong in that, because the people demands that. If the people demands, then the administration, the government has to provide it. If the government has to provide it, then they have to go beyond the budgetary provisions, and therefore they will be actually always have a off budget borrowing in different forms. If it is an off budget borrowing, then things are not going to be very good in a longer period. So these are the things which we have to keep in mind, and then only we can have an effective adjustment, fiscal adjustment, whether it is in the same context of center or in the context of state. So with this point, I would like to conclude the lecture. Thank you for listening all this lecture. Thanks.